The King's Speech 2026, Brighter Britain, the missing legislation. Honestly, I feel like I just need to speak about this personally. I'm not, the King's Speech and the missing people. The King's Speech, the missing legislation, and the missing people. Today we had the King's Speech, the day of the government where they lay out its own legislation agenda and tells the country what matters the most. We were promised renewal, fairness, opportunity, justice, and what Keir Starmer calls Brighter Britain. That's a nice slogan, isn't it? But this morning I am thinking I want to talk about what actually was missing, not accidentally missing, but deliberately absent. Because while the country listened to speeches about economic growth, which is perfectly fine, infrastructure, defense, trade, and national priorities, one of the most catastrophic safeguarding crises in modern Britain was effectively invisible yet again. No serious legislation framework addressing family court reform, coercive legislation, strategic financial abuse, procedural safeguarding collapse, participation impairment, or economic destruction caused through prolonged family proceedings. And that omission matters. It matters because every single day, women, children, fathers, families, and vulnerable individuals are entering procedural systems that are not designed for modern coercive control. And while politicians stand at podiums speaking about brighter Britain, many people are trying simply to survive within their financial destruction, litigation exhaustion, and homelessness, debt, safeguarding failures, and institutional fragmentation. That is the reality beneath the slogan. I am amazed. So the political chaos, this distraction machine, there's a lot going on right now. And what happened today proves something else as well. Even on the day the nation's laws are presented, political infighting still takes priority over structural safeguarding. We watched, well, I did, briefing wars, internal positioning, resignation, speculation, and media distraction dominating the national conversation. And this is important because it reveals a deeper truth about governance itself. The political system constantly reacts to power, visibility, pressure, headlines, and internal survival. Meanwhile, safeguarding crisis inside family justice remains structurally unresolved. Decades after decades, speech after speech is always neglected. And I want people to really think about that, because this is not a small issue. Family proceedings affect housing, finances, parenting, mental health, children, trauma, economic stability, and long-term participation in society itself. But where is the legislation's agency? Where is the emergency response? Where is the operational safeguarding reform? Where is the infrastructure? Please, Keir Starmer, tell me who wrote this agenda for the King to speak on. Fact-finding hearings, procedural pivot points, nothing. So let us talk about the fact-finding hearings and how they really impact people, because the public still do not understand what these hearings actually do and the impact from them. Fact-finding hearings are not merely about who is telling the truth or finding the facts in issue. They determine what the system will officially remember. And once findings are made or not made for future systems that rely on that procedural record, that includes CAFCAS, social services or social workers, safeguarding teams, experts, and the future judges. So, when coercive control is minimized, excluded, narrowed, or procedurally erased, protection itself may disappear. And this is where the public has been deeply misled, because coercive control is not always bruises, shouting, or visible violence. It is psychological, financial, it is cumulative, it is contextual, and it is behavioral. But the system still frequently searches for incidences, snapshots, isolated moments, and procedural neatness. Trauma does not present neatly. Trauma affects memory, sequencing, concentration, speech, and the nervous system. It affects the nervous system regulation. Meanwhile, highly controlling personalities often appear calm, composed, articulate, and procedurally organized. That is a facade. So the system frequently rewards performance over context. And then we hear the most dangerous phrase in family proceedings: no findings made. But no findings made does not necessarily mean no harm occurred. Sometimes it means trauma was misunderstood, participation collapsed, evidence fragmented, disclosure failed, or the procedural system itself was incapable of recognizing coercive control contextually. And once findings disappear, protection frequently disappears with them. So the strategic obfuscation, financial erasure within the system, financial obfuscation. Let us now move to that strategic obfuscation, because modern coercive abuse increasingly operates financially, not simply through withholding money or controlling bank cards, no, but through procedural complexity, disclosure warfare, delay, opacity, and exhaustion. This is financial strangulation of the self-sufficient, and people need to understand that. They need to understand that clearly. Many survivors of domestic abuse entering family proceedings were functioning, working, financially stable, independent, and economically active. Then prolonged litigation begins, okay, and suddenly all that you were, that I've just mentioned just now, escalates through course, disclosure becomes fragmented, proceedings drag on, debts increase, credit distortion, and housing instability begins to start showing up. And because the system remains fragmented, nobody joins the dots. The courts see litigation, the banks see the arrears, okay? The arrears on the mortgage, on the credit cards, on the bills, on the what? The credit agency sees financial deterioration. Safeguarding systems see conflict, but nobody operationally identifies the integrated, cohesive structure that chips away. And this is one of the most greatest safeguarding gaps in Britain right now. Because once credit collapses, housing becomes unstable, and debt escalates, recovery becomes extraordinarily difficult. There is no integrated FCA safeguarding structure in place, cohesive debt protection systems, or operational infrastructure capable of protecting people from litigation-induced financial destruction and strangulation. So survivors are often financially punished throughout, actually, for surviving abuse itself. The industry, this is an industry of harm. This was the missing piece in today's King's speech. And this brings us to the hardest part of the conversation: the procedural, economic surrounding family court proceedings. Because people keep asking, how can this continue happening in the 21st century in Great Britain? So how can we have a brighter Britain? The answer is because unresolved conflict generates enormous institutional activity. So every hearing, assessment, report, adjournment, application, and procedural extension creates continuing procedural movement. Now, let me be very precise. This is not simplistic conspiracy language. This is structural system analysis, because where systems become heavily dependent upon prolonged process, fragmentation, and unresolved conflict, serious public policy questions arise about institutional incentives, and meanwhile, the person at the center of the process often experiences financial collapse, emotional exhaustion, participation impairment, and survival level stresses, the goal eventually stops becoming justice. The goal becomes surviving the process itself. And that is often one of the darkest realities inside modern family proceedings right now. Everyone talks about family courts letting children and mothers down or victims down. The legislation, that's the missing part, the missing legislation. So I ask again, where was the legislation? Where was the Family Justice Reform Bill, the coercive debt, the framework, the participation integrity protections, the safeguarding accountability, the infrastructure, the operational response to economic abuse? Where was the recognition that domestic abuse is not merely interpersonal harm, but increasingly systematic and procedural harm? Because until Britain confronts coercive litigation, safeguarding fragmentation, economic abuse, and the participation collapse, the promise of brighter Britain is far from reach. It remains incomplete because there is a group and a class of persons that are missing from that bill that was not mentioned today in the agenda that our king was speaking of. So they tried to bury people beneath procedure, fragmentation, debt, delay, and silence. But some of us documented it. I did. And some of us studied it. And some of us built the framework. But that framework is being ignored by those that we need to have the conversations with. And that is why this conversation is no longer disappearing quietly, because the public is beginning to understand something fundamentally. A justice system cannot call itself protective while people are being procedurally erased inside it. This is Samantha. Silence screams loud strength. I was talking about unmasking justice today, and this was the King's Speech 2026, Brighter Britain, and the missing legislation. I thank you.